Snow fell like soft ash over the town of Ash Hollow, turning every roof and fence post into something ghostly and forgotten. The wind moved slow, carrying the hush of winter through empty streets where even the horses seemed to breathe more quietly. On mornings like this, the world looked paused, like time itself had chosen to wait. It was in that silence that a small puppy appeared, trembling and half buried by the storm, dragging behind it a black leather bag too large for its fragile jaw. Its fur, once white, was now clotted with ice and mud. With each step it stumbled, leaving a dotted trail of blood where its paws had cracked against the frozen ground. The bag thudded with a dull sound against the cobblestones, the way a heart might sound if it could fall. Somewhere a bell tolled, one, then nothing more. Inside the town's old hospital, a single lamp flickered. Dr. Elias Rowan sat slumped at his desk, his face lit by the amber glow of whiskey and exhaustion. He hadn't slept properly in weeks. He never did during winter. There was something in the cold that brought ghosts closer, especially the ones with names. On his desk sat a photograph, his wife Eleanor and their daughter June, smiling in the brief, impossible sunlight of another life. Their faces had faded with time, but the ache they left never had. He was turning the photo over in his hands when the sound came, a faint scratching at the door. It was so soft he thought it might be the wind. Then came a whimper, a sound so full of desperation it made his chest tighten. He rose slowly, crossing the dim corridor, each step echoing like memory against the tiles. When he opened the door, Snow burst in, carrying with it the small trembling creature. The puppy collapsed at his boots, breath shallow, body shivering violently. A black leather bag dangled from its mouth, smeared with dirt and faint traces of blood. For a long moment, Elias simply stared. He could have sworn the animal was looking up at him, not begging but pleading, as if trying to hand him something sacred before it was too late. He knelt, gently pried the strap from its jaw, and called out for the nurse. Mara Quinn appeared from the ward, her dark hair tied back, her cheeks pale against the lamplight. She moved like someone who had learned long ago to make her steps soundless, her voice low, her presence steady. "Poor thing," she whispered, kneeling beside the dog. "He's freezing." Elias nodded, his breath visible in the chill that slipped through the open door. "Bring a blanket, and boil some water." While she moved, he opened the black bag. Inside lay a small folded blanket, damp but carefully wrapped. A wooden cross carved crudely by hand, and a note, written in a hurried scrawl that had begun to fade in the damp. He unfolded it with care, his fingers trembling slightly as he read, "If you find this bag, please, help my baby. Her name is Alara." The paper smelled faintly of smoke and pine. He felt something ancient stir inside him, a guilt he thought had long gone dormant. Mara returned, her eyes falling on the note. "A baby?" she whispered. Elias only nodded. The snow hissed softly outside, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then he knelt again beside the puppy, gently running his fingers over its frost-bitten paw. "You came a long way, didn't you?" His voice cracked a little on the words. "Trying to save someone." That night the hospital was quieter than usual. The storm raged, shaking the windows, but inside there was only the rhythm of the old clock and the faint sound of the puppy's breathing. Mara had made a small bed for it near the stove, wrapping it in an old towel. It slept uneasily, sometimes whining as if caught between dreams and memory. Elias sat nearby, unable to return to his desk. The black bag lay beside him, its contents spread out neatly on the table. The blanket inside was small, hand-stitched, the name Alara embroidered along the edge with delicate, uneven letters. Whoever had written that note had done so with trembling hands and hope too thin to hold. Mara spoke quietly. "You think there's a child out there?" "There's something," he said, his eyes still on the blanket. "And someone cared enough to send this dog through the storm to find help." Outside, the wind screamed against the walls, but the sound felt distant. Elias felt a weight return to his chest, the same one he had carried since the night he'd lost his family. He remembered that storm, the way his wife's hand had slipped from his as the floodwater took her, the helplessness that had followed. Since then, he had learned to mend bones, close wounds, stitch flesh, but not that kind of hurt. As dawn approached, the snow eased. The town began to stir, its whispers carried on the morning wind. Word spread quickly, about the dog, the bag, the note. Widow Lark was the first to arrive, her shawl dusted with frost. her voice trembling with the excitement of something new to tell. "They say that dog came from the ridge," she said, her eyes darting toward the hospital door. "No one's lived there since the Lorne girl ran off. You remember her, quiet thing, always wandering near the woods?" Elias said nothing, but Mara's expression shifted. "You mean Ivy Lorne?" Widow Lark nodded. "That's the one. Some folks said she was sick. Others said she had a baby, but no one ever saw it. Disappeared after the last snow." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Maybe that's who sent the dog." When she left, silence followed her out. Mara looked at Elias, waiting for him to speak, but he only stared through the frosted window. Later that afternoon, Elias stood at the hospital door. The puppy, now awake, had limped outside and settled in the snow again, facing the direction of the ridge as if waiting. No matter how many times Mara tried to bring it in, it returned to that same spot. Each evening, as the sky turned violet and smoke rose from chimneys, it would lift its head and howl softly into the distance. It wasn't the lonely kind of cry. It was a call, a plea, something ancient in the throat of a creature that refused to forget. One evening, Elias joined it. He stood by the door, coat pulled tight, watching the dog's breath curl in the cold air. Behind him, the hospital's lights flickered against the glass, the only warm thing in sight. "You're waiting for her," he murmured, "whoever she is." He thought of the name again, Ilara, and of the child who might still be somewhere out there, wrapped in the same kind of cold that had once taken everything from him. For the first time in years, he felt something shift inside, an ache that wasn't just pain but purpose. He began preparing quietly. Maps of the ridge, a lantern, extra blankets. Mara noticed the change before he said a word. "You're going out there," she said softly. "I have to," he replied. "Someone sent that dog for a reason. You'll need help," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, the silence between them deep but not empty. Then he nodded. They set out the next morning before dawn. The sky was the color of old pewter, and snow still clung to the trees like memory. Saul, the name carved faintly into the dog's collar, led the way, limping but determined. Each breath from its small body rose like steam in the bitter air. The path wound upward through a forest of bare aspens, their trunks white as bone. The air smelled of smoke and pine sap, sharp and ancient. With every step, the world grew quieter, until all Elias could hear was the crunch of snow beneath their boots and the steady, faithful sound of the dog's paws. When they reached the ridge, the wind shifted. A burnt scent lingered. There, half buried in the snow, stood what was left of a cabin, its roof caved in, its door splintered by the storm. A child's toy, an old wooden horse, lay broken near the steps. Sol ran ahead, barking once before stopping by the doorway. Elias followed, his heart heavy, his breath uneven. Inside, the air was still and cold. The remains of a small fire sat in the corner, long dead. On the table, half-burned papers, scraps of cloth, a cracked photo frame. Among the ashes, something caught his eye, a torn page from a journal. Edges blackened, words barely legible. "If you find Saul, please tell him I tried." Mara turned to him, her face pale in the fading light. "Sul," she whispered. "That's his name." Elias folded the page carefully, his eyes stinging. And she wanted him to find someone. The wind howled through the broken door, carrying the scent of pine and sorrow. Elias looked down at the small dog, who stood motionless now, nose pressed to the floorboards, whining softly. There, in that ruined cabin, surrounded by the echoes of lives half-lived, Elias felt something awaken, a promise made silently to the storm. He crouched beside Sol and spoke in a voice barely louder than the wind. "We'll find her," he said. "I swear it." The dog lifted its head, eyes glinting with something that might have been hope, or memory. Outside, the snow began to fall again, softer now, as though the world itself was holding its breath. And when Elias and Mara turned back toward the path, the ridge seemed to watch them go, the cabin behind them whispering to the wind as if sending them onward. The trail back to town was long, but for the first time Elias didn't feel alone. He could feel the weight of the black bag against his chest, the pulse of a story still unfinished. Somewhere beyond the snow, a child waited, and though he didn't know it yet, the search for that child would change everything he had left to believe in. The dog walked ahead, its tail low but steady, leading them through the white silence of the mountain, toward whatever truth waited beneath the next sunrise. Morning came like a pale ghost, the kind that carried more silence than light. The snowstorm had passed, but its memory lingered in the brittle air. Elias and Mara trudged onward through the ridge, their breaths shallow, their faces stiffened by cold. Saul led them faithfully, his small body pressing through the drifts with a kind of desperate purpose, every few steps pausing to sniff the air as if chasing the ghost of a scent. The mountain seemed endless, an expanse of white that devoured the sky. Yet there was a strange peace in it, the kind that exists only when the world has gone quiet enough to hear your own heart. Mara walked slightly behind, her gloved hands clutched around the lantern that barely flickered against the wind. Her voice, when it came, was soft, as though she were speaking to herself. How could anyone survive out here? Elias didn't answer. He had no faith left in survival. He had only the stubbornness that comes after too much loss. The ridge loomed higher, and with every step the snow grew deeper. He could feel the ache in his chest that wasn't just from the climb. It was something older, something buried that refused to die. When the first traces of smoke reached them, faint and sour, Elias knew they were close. The cabin appeared out of the fog like a memory half-remembered. Walls blackened by fire, roof sunken inward, the doorway half-collapsed under snow. Saul barked once, then again, the sound sharp against the cold. Inside, the air was still. The remains of life lay scattered. A cradle fashioned from a wooden crate, blankets stiff with frost, a cracked mug resting beside a heap of ash. A broken window let in slivers of wind that moved like whispers across the floor. Elias's boots crunched against glass as he stepped forward. Something on the table caught his attention, a small, charred book. He brushed the soot away and saw writing on the cover, Ivy Lorne. He opened it, careful not to let the pages crumble. The ink was faded, but the words were still there, trembling on the paper as though written in haste. I came to town again today. The doctor turned me away, said I couldn't pay. I don't blame him. He looked tired. Maybe he's lost someone too. Elias froze. His throat went dry. He could see it now, her face at the clinic weeks ago, pale and desperate, holding a bundle close to her chest. He had told her there were rules, that medicine wasn't free. He had turned her away with polite finality, telling himself he was being fair. He hadn't known she was dying. Or maybe he had and hadn't wanted to see it. He turned another page. If I can't make it, I'll send Sewell. He knows the way. Maybe someone will still have kindness left. His hands trembled. The lantern light flickered against his face, revealing eyes gone hollow with recognition. Mara stepped closer, reading over his shoulder. Her breath caught when she saw the words. You were the one she meant, she whispered. He didn't answer. He couldn't. The silence between them was heavier than the snow outside. Saul whined softly and began scratching at the corner of the room, where the boards had warped from heat. Elias and Mara knelt beside him, brushing away ashes and ice. Beneath the debris lay a loose plank. When Elias pried it open, cold air rushed up from the hollow beneath. There, wrapped in the remnants of a blanket embroidered with the name Ilara, was a child. Small, pale, motionless, but breathing. Mara's cry broke the stillness. She lifted the child gently, her arms trembling as she pressed her to her chest. She's alive, she whispered, half in disbelief, half in prayer. Elias reached out, his fingers brushing the child's cheek. Her skin was cold as river stones, but her pulse fluttered faintly beneath it. He could feel the life there, fragile but stubborn, refusing to give in. He swallowed the burn in his throat. We need to get her warm. The storm had left the path back treacherous, but there was no hesitation. Elias wrapped the baby inside his coat close to his heart. Saul ran ahead again, his tiny form cutting through the drifts like a living compass. Mara followed close behind, lantern swaying in her hand, her voice steadying him whenever he stumbled. The descent felt endless. Wind whipped at their faces, clawed at their clothes, but Elias barely felt it. The child's faint breath against his chest was the only thing that mattered. He could feel his pulse aligning with hers, as though some divine barter was being made, his guilt traded for her fragile heartbeat. By the time they reached the town, the sky had turned the color of old pewter. Mara burst through the hospital doors first, shouting for blankets and hot water. The few patients still there stirred from their cots, faces filled with confusion that melted quickly into awe when they saw what Elias carried. They worked in silence. Elias held the child close as Mara rubbed warmth into her limbs, whispering encouragement through clenched teeth. The puppy sat by the bedside, his head resting on the edge of the blanket. eyes never leaving the child's face. Hours passed. The fire crackled weakly and the smell of melting snow filled the room. Then just as dawn began to stain the windows pale gold, the baby's hand twitched. A small sound escaped her throat, a sigh so faint it could have been mistaken for wind. Mara gasped. Elias felt tears he didn't recognize slide down his cheeks. He had forgotten what relief felt like. It came now like sunlight breaking through an endless storm. "She's going to make it," Mara whispered. Elias nodded, his voice barely holding steady. "She's stronger than I ever was." Word of what happened spread quickly through Ash Hollow. By evening, the town that once whispered with judgment now spoke in quiet reverence. Widow Lark came again, her voice trembling for different reasons this time. "They say you found the child alive," she said. "That dog led you to her." Elias didn't correct her. He only nodded. There was no need for words. The story had already begun to live beyond them. Over the following days, the hospital changed. Elias reopened the unused ward, clearing dust and setting up beds for anyone who came with empty pockets. He hung a small wooden sign above the door, Ivy's wing. Each night when the halls quieted, he would sit beside the crib where Ilara slept. The puppy never left her side. Sometimes she'd wake and reach out a tiny hand, curling her fingers into his fur. Watching them, Elias felt something he hadn't known in years, a peace that didn't come from forgetting but from forgiving. Mara often joined him, sitting silently nearby, her presence a steady warmth. Their words were few, but their gestures spoke enough. A cup of tea left on his desk, a blanket draped across his shoulders, a look that lingered just a second too long. It wasn't romance in the way youth imagines it. It was gentler, quieter, a kind of shared healing between two people who had been standing too long in the cold. One evening, Mara found him outside beneath the old elm tree where the snow had begun to melt. He was holding the black leather bag. "You're keeping it?" she asked. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes only after tears. "It belongs here now." She carried her hope in it. "I'll keep it for her." He knelt and buried it gently beneath the roots, his hands steady. Sol sat beside him watching. The sun dipped behind the hills, setting the snow aflame with gold. The air smelled of thawing earth and smoke, like the first breath of spring. Months passed and life began to return to Ash Hollow. The river thawed, the church bell rang again, and the townsfolk stopped lowering their voices when speaking of tragedy. They spoke instead of small miracles, of a doctor who had changed, of a child who had lived, of a dog who had carried love through a storm. On one of those mornings, Elias walked out to the edge of town with Ilara in his arms. She was heavier now, her cheeks flushed with health. Sol trotted at his heels, tail wagging softly. He stopped beneath the elm where wildflowers had begun to bloom and let the child reach for the petals. The wind moved gently through the branches. He closed his eyes and breathed it in, the world at last still. "Ivy," he whispered. She made it. For a long moment he stayed there, the sunlight warm against his face. Then from behind him came Mara's voice. She would have been proud. He turned, and for a brief instant, their eyes met. No words, only understanding. The kind that runs deeper than apology or promise. That night, as dusk settled, the narrator's voice would have spoken softly, had this been a tale told aloud. There are stories that never reach the papers, only the hearts that need them most, and perhaps that was enough. Because mercy, Elias learned, doesn't always arrive like a miracle. Sometimes it comes on 4 trembling paws carrying the memory of love through the snow. If you listened closely in Ash Hollow, long after, you could still hear the faint echo of that small dog's steps on frozen ground, the sound of hope refusing to die, and every whisper of wind that passed through the hospital windows carried the same quiet lesson. Even the lost can find their way home again. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe for more whispered tales that remember what the world too often forgets.